Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you like what you see, share it with your friends and family too. I never thought taking a job as a mall Santa would change my life forever. My name's Michael Turner, and trust me, wearing a fake white beard wasn't exactly my dream job. But when you're 3 months behind on rent and living on ramen noodles, you take what you can get. The Riverside Mall wasn't doing so great either. Half the stores were empty, with their metal shutters permanently down. The Christmas decorations looked like they hadn't been updated since the 90s, and the giant plastic candy canes in the food court were covered in a layer of dust. But hey, at least the place was heated and the pay was decent. "You'll do fine," Sarah from HR told me while handing over my Santa suit. "Just smile, listen to the kids, and try not to sneeze. The beard gets itchy." She wasn't kidding about the itching. The suit smelled like mothballs and something else I couldn't quite place, something old. My first day started normally enough. The Santa chair was this massive red velvet thing that looked way fancier than anything else in the mall. Funny how they spent money on that but couldn't fix the flickering lights in the corridor. The North Pole setup around me was pretty basic. Some fake snow, a few plastic reindeer, and a sad-looking Christmas tree. The kids were the usual mix. Some excited, some crying, some just wanting to get it over with. Little Tommy wanted a PlayStation, Sarah wanted a puppy, and Max wouldn't stop pulling my beard to check if it was real. Standard stuff. But then, while adjusting my cushion during a break, I felt something crinkle beneath me. Reaching under the cushion, I pulled out what looked like an old piece of paper. It was yellow with age, the edges crumbling, and written at the top in elegant red handwriting were the words, "Santa's List, 1954. I probably should have just turned it in to Lost and Found, or thrown it away. But something about that list made me want to keep it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else was pulling me toward it. Whatever it was, I slipped it into my pocket just as my break ended. That's when things started getting weird, really weird. Looking back now, I wish I'd called in sick that day, because what happened next turned this simple mall Santa gig into the scariest 3 days of my life. And by Christmas Eve, nothing would ever be the same. The first strange thing I noticed was little Jenny Miller's name. She hopped onto my lap that afternoon, and as she told me she wanted a real fairy princess dress, I felt the old list burn in my pocket. During my next break, I pulled it out, and there it was, Jennifer Miller, written in the same red ink, appearing right before my eyes. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was just tired. But no, her name was definitely there, along with Fairy Princess Dress next to it. "You're losing it, Michael," I told myself, stuffing the list back in my pocket. But then things got even weirder. The next morning, Jenny's mom came running through the mall, crying and shaking. "It's impossible," she kept saying. "The dress, it just appeared in her room overnight. But I didn't buy it. Nobody bought it." My stomach turned to ice. The dress Jenny had described, down to its sparkly pink ribbons and magical glow, was exactly what she was wearing. But her mom's face, she looked terrified, not happy. That's when I noticed the mall manager, Mr. Peters, watching from behind a pillar. There was something off about him. His ears. Were they always that pointy? And why did his eyes seem to glitter like that? 2 more kids came that day. Tommy wished for a robot dog, and Amy wanted her grandmother's lost locket back. Both their names appeared on the list right after they told me their wishes. I tried showing the list to Sarah from HR, but every time I pulled it out to show someone else, the names disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spread the list out on my kitchen table and studied it. The paper felt wrong, too cold, like touching ice. And there was something else that scared me. At the bottom of each page in tiny letters were the words, "All wishes require payment." I didn't understand what that meant until the next morning, when I heard about Tommy's dad. The mall was buzzing with whispers. Tommy got his robot dog all right. It was sitting in his room when he woke up. But his dad never woke up. The doctors couldn't explain it. He just stopped breathing in his sleep. That's when I knew the list wasn't just granting wishes, it was collecting souls. And as I walked into work that morning, I saw all the mall management staff huddled together watching me. Their ears all seemed pointier than before, and their smiles were too wide, showing too many teeth. I had to figure out how to stop this. But I only had 2 days until Christmas Eve, and somehow, I knew that's when everything would become permanent. The list in my pocket felt heavier than ever, and somewhere in the mall I heard bells jingling. Not the cheerful kind. These sounded more like warning bells. And they were getting closer. I needed answers, and fast. During my lunch break, I headed to Wilson's toy shop at the far end of the mall. Old Mr. Wilson had owned the store since forever. If anyone knew anything about the mall's history, it would be him. The bell above his shop door jingled as I walked in. Mr. Wilson was arranging old-fashioned teddy bears, his hands shaking slightly. When I mentioned the 1954 list, all the color drained from his face. "Sit down, son," he said, flipping his open sign to closed. "I was here when they first built this mall. There's something you need to know." But before he could tell me more, Amy came running into the store, tears streaming down her face. "It worked, Santa. I found Grandma's locket." She held up a golden heart-shaped locket, exactly like she described. But her voice cracked. "Grandma won't wake up." My heart sank. Another wish, another price paid. Mr. Wilson grabbed my arm. "Listen carefully," he whispered. "That list belonged to the real Santa, but it was stolen by dark elves, the ones who wanted to twist Christmas magic for their own gain. They've been hiding here, running this mall, waiting for someone to find it, and..." Suddenly, the lights flickered. Mr. Wilson's face went pale. "They're coming. You need to." The door burst open. Mall security guards walked in, but something was wrong with them. Their movements were too stiff, like puppets, and their eyes had that same glitter I'd seen in the manager's eyes. "Everything okay in here?" one asked. But his smile wasn't friendly at all. "Just fine," I said quickly. "Just shopping for, teddy bears." They left, but not before giving Mr. Wilson a look that made my skin crawl. That evening, they found Mr. Wilson in his store. They said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. He'd tried to help me, and it had cost him his life. Back at my Santa chair, more kids came with wishes. A new bike, a gaming console, a puppy. Each wish appeared on the list, and each morning brought news of another accident, another parent who wouldn't wake up. I tried ripping up the list, but the pieces just came back together. I tried burning it, but the flames wouldn't catch. Even my attempt to throw it in the mall fountain failed. It floated back to me, dry as ever. The mall managers were watching me constantly now. Their disguises were slipping. I could see their true forms flickering like bad TV reception. Pointed ears, sharp teeth, eyes that glowed in the shadows. Then I found a note in my locker, written in the same red ink as the list. "Christmas Eve approaches. Santa's replacement. When the clock strikes midnight, all wishes become permanent. All prices must be paid. You cannot stop what has already begun." I looked at my watch. December 24th, 8:40 a.m. I had 16 hours to figure out how to destroy this list, or every wish would claim its price forever. And somewhere in the mall, those warning bells were still ringing. Things got worse as Christmas Eve went on. The mall was packed with last-minute shoppers, and kids kept coming to see Santa. Each wish felt like a punch to my stomach. I wanted to tell them to stop, to run away, but the security guards were always watching. During my afternoon break, I hid in the employee bathroom and studied the list again. That's when I noticed something new, tiny words appearing at the edges of the paper, like a secret message. "Only true Christmas spirit can break dark magic." But what did that even mean? I was interrupted by screaming from the food court. 2 security guards had cornered a mom who was trying to leave with her kids. Their movements were all wrong, like broken robots. As I watched, their skin seemed to ripple, showing glimpses of something green and scaly underneath. Just one more wish, they were saying. Your children haven't visited Santa yet. I had to do something. Running over, I shouted, "Hey, leave them alone!" The guards turned to me, their eyes glowing red now. One of them grabbed my arm, and his hand felt ice cold. "You should be at your post, Santa," he hissed. "Children are waiting." That's when the mall's speakers crackled to life. Instead of Christmas music, there was this weird chanting. All around the mall, the managers and security guards straightened up, like they were answering some silent call. Mr. Peters, the mall manager, appeared beside me. He wasn't even trying to look human anymore. His ears were fully pointed, his skin had a greenish tint, and his smile showed rows of sharp teeth. "You've caused enough trouble," he said. "The list does its work every 70 years. The dark elves must feed, and you're just a temporary Santa who should have minded his own business." "What about the families?" I asked. "The people who died?" He shrugged. "Magic requires payment. Always has, always will." The mall was getting darker, even though it was only 4 p.m. The Christmas lights were changing color, from warm white to an eerie green. Parents were hurrying their children toward the exits, but some of the doors wouldn't open. I looked at my watch. 8 hours until midnight. The list in my pocket felt like it was made of ice now. More names kept appearing, more wishes, more families in danger. I had to figure out what true Christmas spirit meant before it was too late. That's when I remembered something Mr. Wilson had told me just before he died. He'd started to say something about the mall's Christmas tree, the giant one in the center court. Maybe, just maybe, that was where I needed to go. But as I turned toward the center court, I saw them, all the corrupt mall staff forming a circle around me. Their human disguises were completely gone now, and they were closing in. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, still wearing that stupid Santa suit. The dark elves were right behind me, their feet making weird scratching sounds on the mall floor. The giant Christmas tree in center court was my only hope. But why? What was so special about it? I dodged through the panicking crowd, past the abandoned stores. The mall lights kept flickering, making everything look like a scary movie. Behind me, I could hear Mr. Peters shouting orders to his elf guards. That's when I crashed into Jenny Miller, the first kid whose wish had started all this. She was crying. "Santa," she sobbed, "I want to give the dress back. Please, I want my mommy to be okay again." Something clicked in my brain. True Christmas spirit. It wasn't about getting presents, it was about giving. About love. "Jenny," I said quickly, "do you really mean that? Would you give up your wish to save your mom?" She nodded, tears running down her face. The list in my pocket suddenly felt warm instead of ice cold. "Everyone," I shouted as loud as I could. "All the kids who made wishes, if you can hear me, you can take them back. Think about your families." The dark elves were getting closer. Mr. Peters' face was twisted with rage. "Stop him!" But something amazing was happening. Kids were appearing from all over the mall. Tommy with his robot dog, Amy with her grandmother's locket, all of them bringing back their wished-for items. "The tree!" I heard a weak voice call out. It was Mr. Wilson, but not really him, more like his ghost. He was pointing at the Christmas tree. The star. It's the real one, from the North Pole. The star on top of the tree was glowing brighter now, but with a warm, golden light instead of the elves' creepy green glow. I looked at my watch. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. The list was burning hot in my pocket now. I fought my way through the crowd toward the tree, the dark elves right on my heels. One grabbed my coat, I slipped out of it. Another tried to trip me. I jumped over his arm. The tree was right there, just a few more steps. But Mr. Peters appeared in front of me, his eyes blazing red. "You can't stop this," he snarled. "The dark magic must be fed." Behind me, I heard Jenny's voice again. I wish for everyone to be okay again." and that's when I realized what I had to do. The next few seconds would decide everything. I reached for the star, the list clutched in my other hand, as the mall's Christmas Eve clock began to strike midnight. The first chime of midnight rang through the mall. With all my strength, I jumped and thrust the list toward the star on the tree. Mr. Peters grabbed my leg, but it was too late. The moment the list touched the star, a blast of warm, golden light filled the entire mall. It was like someone had captured the feeling of every happy Christmas morning and turned it into light. "No!" screamed Mr. Peters, but his voice was fading. All around us, the dark elves were disappearing like smoke in the wind. Their horrible green glow was being washed away by the star's golden light. The list in my hand began to glow too, but instead of burning, it was changing. The names written in red ink were turning to gold, and then floating off the page like golden snowflakes. Each one drifted away, carrying its wish back with it. Then I heard gasps and cries of joy from behind me. Tommy's dad was there, looking confused but very much alive. Amy's grandmother was hugging her tight. Jenny's mom was okay too. Everyone who had been taken as payment was coming back, appearing right there in the mall. The last chime of midnight faded away. The list in my hand crumbled into nothing more than ordinary dust. When I looked around, all the dark elves were gone. The mall looked normal again, maybe even a bit brighter than before. Mr. Wilson appeared one last time, but now he was smiling. "Well done, son," he said, starting to fade away. "You found the true meaning of Christmas. It's not about getting, it's about giving, about love and family." Then he was gone too, but I knew he was finally at peace. The mall's regular lights came back on. Parents were hugging their kids. The wished-for toys had disappeared, but nobody cared. They had their families back. As everyone began heading home for Christmas, Jenny tugged on my sleeve. "Thank you, Santa," she whispered. This was better than any fairy princess dress. I smiled and gave her a hug. "Merry Christmas, Jenny." Later that night, as I walked to my car, I saw something that made me stop. Through the mall's glass doors, I could see the Christmas tree star twinkling with a warm golden light. And just for a second, I thought I saw a reflection of the real Santa in the glass, nodding at me with a kind smile. I never worked as a mall Santa again after that, but every Christmas Eve I visit Riverside Mall just to check on that star. It still glows with that special golden light, keeping watch, making sure no dark magic ever returns. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the happy sound of real Christmas bells, reminding us what the holiday is truly about. I never thought a job at Morrison, Sterling, would turn my life into a horror story. My name is Robert Blackwood, and what I'm about to tell you happened during my first Christmas season at what seemed like a dream job. It all started on December 1st. I remember walking into that gleaming glass building, my new ID card hanging proudly around my neck. The lobby was already decked out in Christmas decorations, a massive tree touching the ceiling, twinkling lights everywhere, and the smell of cinnamon and pine in the air. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, maybe. "Welcome aboard, Robert." My manager, Sarah Chen, greeted me with a wide smile. "You've joined us at the best time of the year." She showed me to my desk, which was nicer than anything I'd had at my old job. The whole office buzzed with energy, and everyone seemed weirdly happy. During my first team meeting, I noticed something odd. People kept whispering about the upcoming Secret Santa event. Not your usual excited whispers, but nervous ones. When I asked my cubicle neighbor, Tom, about it, his face went pale. "Oh, the Secret Santa? It's special here," he said, his hands shaking a little as he typed. "Whatever you do, don't forget to participate. Nobody ever forgets to participate." I laughed it off then. I mean, how serious could a office Secret Santa be? But that afternoon, the email arrived in everyone's inbox. It wasn't from HR or the party committee. It came directly from the CEO's office. Annual Secret Santa Society Exchange. Participation mandatory. Failure to participate will affect your holiday bonus structure. The way people stared at their screens after getting that email, it wasn't normal. Some looked scared, others resigned. One lady in accounting actually started crying. "Don't worry," Sarah told me later that day, putting a hand on my shoulder that felt too heavy, too cold. "Just follow the rules, and everything will be fine. The society takes care of its own." The way she said society sent chills down my spine. I didn't know it then, but that was my first warning. I should have run right there and then. Instead, I smiled and nodded, excited about my first big corporate Christmas party. If only I'd known that at Morrison Sterling, Secret Santa wasn't about spreading joy. It was about something much, much darker. And I was about to become part of their ancient ritual, whether I wanted to or not. The first gift appeared on my desk 3 days later, just a small red box with a black ribbon. No tag saying who it was from, just my name written in weird, swirly handwriting. Inside was a silver pen that looked antique, with strange symbols carved into it. "Nice pen," Tom whispered from his cubicle. Did you feel anything when you touched it?" Before I could ask what he meant, I noticed my fingers tingling where they held the pen. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but throughout the day, the feeling spread up my arm. That night, I had dreams about the office, about dark corridors and whispered chants. Things got weirder when Jenny from marketing got her gift, a beautiful red scarf. The next day, she came to work different. Her usual chatty self was gone. She just sat at her desk, staring at her computer, sometimes mumbling things I couldn't understand. When I walked past her desk, I saw she'd drawn those same symbols from my pen all over her notepad. "It happens every year," Tom told me during lunch break, his voice barely a whisper. "People change after getting their gifts. Last year, my friend Mike from accounting got a watch. A week later, he quit. Nobody's heard from him since. I started paying more attention after that. Each day, more gifts appeared. Each day, more people changed. Sarah, my manager, started having meetings behind closed doors with the executive board. I could hear chanting coming from the conference room late at night when I worked overtime. One evening, while looking for a file in the storage room, I found an old company newsletter from 1985. The headline made my blood run cold. "Morrison Sterling celebrates most successful year after introducing annual holiday tradition." The photo showed the executive board standing around a strange symbol drawn on the floor, the same symbol on my pen. That's when the first death happened. Linda from HR was found in the elevator shaft. They said it was an accident, but I saw her the day before, clutching her Secret Santa gift, a small music box that played a tune I'd never heard before. "The society must be fed," I overheard the CEO telling someone on the phone that evening. "The ritual must be completed by Christmas Eve." I wanted to quit right then, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the pen's influence, or maybe it was the weird feeling that I needed to find out more. Either way, I was getting pulled deeper into whatever dark secret Morrison Sterling was hiding. And the worst part? There were still more gifts to come. I looked at my calendar. 2 weeks until the final gift exchange at midnight on Christmas Eve. 2 weeks to figure out what was happening before I might become another holiday bonus statistic. I knew I had to dig deeper. After everyone left the office that evening, I snuck into Sarah's office. My hands were shaking as I went through her files. In the bottom drawer, hidden under some old reports, I found a leather-bound book titled The Society's Annual Harvest. My phone's flashlight revealed pages filled with names and dates going back 50 years. Each year, 7 employees disappeared during the holiday season. They were listed as offerings. Next to each name was a bonus amount, way too much money for a normal Christmas bonus. While reading, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly took photos of the pages and put everything back. Just as I slipped out, I saw the CEO and other executives walking into the conference room. They were wearing red robes with those same symbols from my pen. The next morning, Linda's desk was already cleared out. Nobody talked about her death. It was like she never existed. But I noticed something else. Her name was now written in fresh ink in that leather book I'd found. "You've been asking questions, Robert." Sarah caught me at the coffee machine. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Curiosity isn't always rewarded here. Focus on your gift-giving duties instead." That afternoon, 2 more people got their gifts. Dave from IT received a mousepad, and Maria from sales got a coffee mug. By the end of the day, Dave was typing strings of weird codes non-stop, his eyes glazed over. Maria just kept filling and refilling her new mug, walking around like a zombie. I tried searching online about Morrison, Sterling's history. The company started in 1922, and every year since then, it had grown more successful. No down years, no losses, not even during major market crashes. It was impossible, unless something supernatural was helping them. The real shock came when I decoded the symbols on my pen using an ancient language website. Translated, they meant, "Marked for Ascension." I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't good. 2 more deaths followed that week. Both looked like accidents. 1 heart attack, 1 car crash in the parking garage. But both victims had received their Secret Santa gifts just days before. The CEO called an all-staff meeting. "Remember," he said, smiling at us, "the final gift exchange at midnight on Christmas Eve is mandatory. It's what makes Morrison, Sterling, one big family." Family, right. A family that sacrificed its members for success. I looked around the room at my coworkers. Some looked scared. Others seemed almost hypnotized. Tom caught my eye and mouthed something. "Help us." Time was running out. 5 days until Christmas Eve, and I still didn't know how to stop what was coming. But one thing was clear, that pen was slowly changing me too. Every time I wrote with it, the urge to join their midnight ritual grew stronger. I had to find a way to expose the truth before we all became part of the society's holiday bonus plan. That night, I decided to stay late at the office again. Around 10 p.m., I heard chanting coming from the executive floor. Hiding behind a large potted plant, I watched as board members entered the CEO's office wearing those red robes. Through the crack in the door, I saw something that made my stomach turn. They stood in a circle around a large Christmas tree, but this was no ordinary tree. Its ornaments glowed with an eerie green light, and instead of a star on top, there was that same symbol from my pen. "The offerings have been marked," the CEO said. "Soon, their energy will feed our success for another year." He held up a list. I recognized the names of everyone who had gotten gifts, including mine. Just then, my phone buzzed loudly. Heart pounding, I ducked into the supply closet as footsteps approached. Through the door slats, I saw Sarah walking past, holding what looked like an ancient book. She dropped it, and as she bent to pick it up, a paper fell out. After she left, I grabbed it. It was an old newspaper clipping from 1922. Local business owners make deal of a lifetime. The article talked about how the company's founders met a mysterious stranger on Christmas Eve, who promised them endless success, for a price. Everything started making sense. The mandatory Secret Santa, the gifts with strange symbols, the changing behavior, the deaths. It wasn't just office politics. It was part of some dark deal made 100 years ago. I went back to my desk to think, but stopped cold. Someone had left another gift. This time, it was a small Christmas ornament with my name on it. When I picked it up, I felt that same tingling sensation stronger now. For a moment, I actually wanted to hang it on that creepy tree upstairs. That's when Tom tapped my shoulder, making me jump. "I've been fighting it too," he whispered, showing me his gift. A stapler with the same symbols. Each gift is like a piece of the puzzle. By the final exchange, we'll be ready for, he shuddered, the harvest. "How many years have you known?" I asked. "This is my 3rd Christmas here. I've watched 21 people disappear. They don't just die, Robert. Their souls fuel the company's success. And this year, He looked at me with sad eyes. "We're both on the list." As if to confirm his words, we heard a scream from the break room. "Another accident." The CEO's voice came over the intercom. "Please avoid the third-floor break room. Cleaning staff will handle the situation." 6 down, 1 to go. And the final gift exchange was only 3 days away. I looked at the ornament in my hand, then at Tom. "We need to stop this," I said. "But how do you fight Christmas magic that's been working for 100 years? Tom's answer chilled me to the bone. "You don't fight it, you become it. And that's exactly what they want." The next 2 days were a blur of terror and paranoia. Every holiday decoration seemed to watch me. The Christmas music playing through the office speakers started to sound like chanting. Even the smell of peppermint coffee made me feel sick. I tried warning people. Really, I did. But nobody would listen. Some just smiled that empty smile I'd seen too much lately. Others practically ran away when I mentioned the secret Santa gift. The magic was too strong. Tom and I made a plan to gather evidence. But when I went to his desk yesterday morning, he wasn't there. His computer was on, a half-typed email on the screen. "Robert, I found something in the basement archives. Meet me." That was it. Just another accident, according to the company-wide email we got an hour later. Tom's desk was cleared by lunch. I knew I was next. The ornament I'd received kept pulling me toward that evil Christmas tree upstairs. Every time I wrote with the pen, my thoughts got fuzzy. I started hearing whispers, telling me how wonderful the final gift exchange would be. Sarah caught me trying to leave early. "Going somewhere, Robert?" Her smile was ice cold. "Remember, tomorrow is our special night. The society needs you there." "What happens at midnight?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. She just straightened my tie, her fingers ice cold. "Magic, Robert. The kind that's kept us on top for a century. Don't you want to be part of something big?" Part of me did want that. The gifts were working their spell on me. That evening, I caught myself drawing those symbols all over my notepad, just like Jenny had done. I tried calling the police, but the words wouldn't come out. I tried sending emails to my family, but my fingers wouldn't type the truth. The society's magic was everywhere. With only 1 day left, I made my last attempt to fight back. I went to the basement archives where Tom had disappeared. In the very back, behind rows of old files, I found a small door with Christmas lights around it. Inside was a room full of Christmas trees. But these weren't normal trees, they were made of glass, each one containing what looked like a floating light. 7 lights per tree, 1 for each year's offering. On a pedestal sat a contract signed in 1922. At the bottom was a note. "The deal may be broken only when the collector of souls receives a gift of their own." The collector of souls? I remembered what the CEO had said about feeding the company's success. Could it be that simple? Did I need to give a gift to whatever dark force was behind all this? As I stood there thinking, the Christmas lights started blinking. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. The final midnight exchange was getting closer, and I had one last chance to stop. If I could just figure out what gift would break this horrible Christmas curse. Christmas Eve, 11:30 p.m. The office party was in full swing, but it felt more like a funeral. Everyone wore red and black, moving like puppets to twisted Christmas carols. The CEO stood by his evil tree, checking his watch every few minutes. I had my plan ready. In my bag was a small gift box containing the one thing I thought might work, a mirror. If this thing fed on souls, maybe showing it its own reflection would break its power. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. At 11:45, Sarah started herding everyone toward the executive floor. I noticed there were exactly 7 empty chairs arranged around the Christmas tree. My hands shook as I joined the circle. "Welcome to the final exchange," the CEO announced. "For 100 years, the society has thrived because of nights like this. Now, let us begin." The lights dimmed. The tree's ornaments started glowing that sickly green. I felt the pen in my pocket grow hot, and the ornament around my neck tried to pull me closer to the tree. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving inside the tree. Something dark and hungry that had been feeding on Morrison, Sterling employees for a century. 11:55 p.m. People started placing their final gifts under the tree. Each package glowed with those awful symbols. "Robert," the CEO called, "your last." I walked forward, fighting against the magic that tried to control me. The shadow in the tree grew larger, reaching out with dark fingers. "You can't fight it," Sarah whispered. "No one ever had." But she was wrong. With shaking hands, I pulled out my gift. The shadow reached for it eagerly. "Want to see what a century of stealing souls looks like?" I said, and opened the box with the mirror facing the tree. The shadow saw itself, all the twisted, horrible things it had done. It screamed, and the sound shattered every ornament in the room. The CEO lunged for me, but he was too late. The mirror cracked, but not before reflecting the shadow back on itself. The tree burst into green flames. All around me, people snapped out of their trance, screaming and running for the exit. I ran too, but not before grabbing that old contract and throwing it into the magical fire. The CEO's howls followed me down the stairs, but I didn't look back. The next day, Morrison Sterling's stock crashed. The papers called it the biggest corporate collapse in history. Nobody remembered the shadow or the souls, just that something went very wrong at a Christmas party. I quit, of course. Found a new job at a smaller company that doesn't do Secret Santa. But every Christmas, I check the business news, making sure Morrison Sterling stays dead. And I keep that cracked mirror on my desk, just in case. Because sometimes, late at night, I still hear Christmas carols that sound like screams, and I remember that the best gift you can give yourself is staying away from office parties that seem too perfect to be true. I never thought buying my dream house would turn into a nightmare. My name is Emma Foster, and this is my story about moving to the most festive street in town, Christmas Lane. It all started when I found this beautiful two-story colonial house at an unbelievable price. The real estate agent seemed almost too eager to sell it. "It's the last house available on Christmas Lane," she said with a weird smile. "You know, the street that wins the city's holiday light competition every year." Of course I knew about Christmas Lane. Everyone in town did. Each December, thousands of people would drive through to see the amazing Christmas displays. I remember going there as a kid, pressing my face against the car window, amazed by the twinkling lights and decorations. The day I moved in was bright and sunny, nothing like the dark times that were coming. My new neighbors showed up right away with welcome baskets and smiles. Mrs. Peterson from next door brought cookies. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts from across the street came with hot chocolate. They all seemed so nice, but there was something off about them. "We're so glad you're here, Emma," Mrs. Peterson said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You know about our Christmas tradition, right? The light display?" "Yes, it's amazing." "Oh, it's more than amazing, dear. It's mandatory." Her voice got serious. "Every house must participate, no exceptions." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Well, I love Christmas, so that won't be a problem." That's when Mr. Roberts handed me a thick binder. "These are the guidelines. Light placement must be exact. Colors must be perfect. Everything must be ready by December 1st. I flipped through the binder. There were hundreds of pages. Maps of where every light should go, timing schedules for blinking patterns, even rules about which extension cords to use. "Don't worry, Mrs. Peterson patted my hand. "We'll help you, the previous owners." She paused. "Well, let's just say they weren't quite up to our standards." "What happened to them?" I asked. "They all went quiet. After what felt like forever," Mrs. Roberts forced a laugh. "Oh, they moved away. Couldn't handle the pressure of keeping up with Christmas Lane's reputation. As they left, I noticed how they all walked in perfect sync, like they'd practiced it. Looking down my new street, I counted 15 houses, all identical except for mine. White paint, green shutters, matching mailboxes. How had I not noticed that before? That night, as I unpacked boxes in my living room, I saw all my neighbors' lights come on at exactly 8:00 p.m. Even though it was only November 1st, their houses were already decorated. The lights made weird shadows on my walls. and I could have sworn I saw them move in patterns that didn't look very Christmas-like at all. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. I was about to learn why the previous owners really disappeared, and why this house, the last house on Christmas Lane, had been so cheap. I should have known that when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. And on Christmas Lane, too good to be true was about to become too terrifying to believe. The next few days were weird, really weird. I started decorating my house according to their rule book. It wasn't easy. Every light had to be exactly 6 inches apart, and they all had to be special bulbs ordered from the neighborhood association. Mrs. Peterson kept watching from her window as I worked. Sometimes she'd come out just to move a light strand an inch to the left or right. The first strange thing I noticed was my missing decorations. I'd put up a row of candy canes along my driveway before going to bed, but in the morning they were on Mrs. Roberts' lawn. When I asked her about it, she just smiled and said, "Oh, the wind must have blown them over." But there hadn't been any wind that night. Then came the lights. I'd wake up at night and see them moving, not just blinking, but actually moving. One night, I watched a string of blue lights slowly crawl across my roof like a glowing caterpillar. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was dreaming, but nope. By morning, those lights were perfectly arranged in a weird star pattern I didn't remember making. "Did you sleep well?" Mr. Roberts asked the next day, grinning like he knew something I didn't. That's when Dave, our postal worker, started noticing things too. "Something's not right about these houses," he told me while delivering mail. "Yesterday, I could have sworn I saw all the snowman decorations turn their heads to watch me walk by." I was glad I wasn't the only one seeing weird stuff. Dave promised to keep an eye out and let me know if he saw anything else strange. But the next day, he didn't show up for his route, or the next day, or the day after that. When I called the post office, they said Dave had suddenly quit, but his car was still parked down the street, covered in a thin layer of frost even though it was 50 degrees outside. The lights kept getting stranger. At exactly midnight, all the houses would light up in sync, making patterns that looked like weird symbols. They reminded me of the ones I'd seen in scary movies, the kind used to summon things that should stay unsummoned. One night I heard chanting coming from the Roberts' basement. When I peeked through their window, I saw all my neighbors standing in a circle, wearing red robes. They were holding candles and speaking in a language I'd never heard before. I tried to record it on my phone, but the video came out all staticky, with weird flashing lights that weren't there when I was filming. The next morning, Mrs. Peterson brought me more cookies. "Only 3 weeks until Christmas Eve," she said cheerfully. "We're all so excited for you to be part of our celebration." The way she said celebration made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I found a dusty box in my attic filled with old newspapers. The headlines made my heart stop. "Family vanishes from Christmas Lane. 3 disappearances in 5 years. Holiday mystery continues." All the missing people? They'd lived in my house. And as I stared at the papers, the Christmas lights outside started blinking in a pattern that looked just like a countdown. Those newspapers scared me so much that I spent the whole night researching Christmas Lane's history. What I found made my blood run cold. The street wasn't always called Christmas Lane. Back in the 1950s, it was called Winter's End Road. A group called the Winter Lightkeepers bought all the land and built identical houses. Every family that moved into my house disappeared, always on Christmas Eve, always after their lights weren't perfect enough. I barely slept that night. The humming of the Christmas lights outside my window kept me awake. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scream. Looking out my window, I saw Mr. Johnson from 3 houses down standing in his yard. He was yelling at his lights, which were blinking out of sync with the others. "Please, no! I can fix it! Just give me time!" The other houses' lights started pulsing brighter and brighter. Mr. Johnson's decorations, the reindeer, the snowmen, even the plastic Santa, all turned to face him. Then all the lights went out at once. When they came back on a second later, Mr. Johnson was gone. Just gone. Only his slippers remained on the frosty grass. The next morning, nobody mentioned Mr. Johnson. His house's lights were working perfectly again, but there was no sign of him. When I asked Mrs. Peterson about it, she just said, "Oh, he moved away suddenly. Family emergency." But her smile looked more like a smirk. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the light patterns formed circles and stars that looked like the symbols I found in old books about winter magic. How the temperature on our street was always colder than anywhere else in town. The way my neighbors never seemed to sleep, always watching, always waiting. I tried calling the police, but every time I dialed, my phone would fill with static and die. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The GPS always showed me at unknown location, even though I could see the street sign. Then I found the old diary in my basement. It belonged to Sarah Mills, who lived here in 1987. The last entry gave me chills. They're not just Christmas decorations. They're keeping something ancient asleep under the street. If the lights ever go out completely, it wakes up. They need a sacrifice every year to keep the lights burning. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. They're coming for me. If you're reading this, run. But I couldn't run. Every time I tried to leave the street, I'd get turned around and end up right back at my house. The neighbors watched and smiled their empty smiles. They knew I was trapped. That's when the second death happened. Mrs. Peterson's husband, Thomas, tried to take down his lights early. He said he couldn't take it anymore. That night, all the inflatable decorations on the street suddenly got bigger, like they were taking a deep breath. There was a sound like winter wind, and then Thomas was just gone. The next day, Mrs. Peterson acted like she'd always lived alone. I was running out of time. Christmas Eve was getting closer, and now I knew why my house was the last one available on Christmas Lane. They were waiting for me. They needed me. And the lights. The lights were getting brighter every night. With just 3 days until Christmas Eve, everything fell apart. I was in my kitchen making hot chocolate when all my Christmas lights turned blood red. There was a knock at my door. When I opened it, all my neighbors were standing there in a half circle, wearing those red robes I'd seen before. Mrs. Peterson stood in front, holding a candlestick. "It's time you learned the truth, Emma," she said. Her voice different now, older somehow, like ice cracking. "We are the Winter Light Keepers. We've been here long before this street existed." They all walked into my house without waiting for an invitation. I backed away, but they kept coming. "Under this street," Mr. Roberts explained, "sleeps something ancient, something hungry. The lights keep it sleeping, but they need power." He smiled, but his teeth looked sharp. "Special power, human power." "The postal worker," I whispered. "Mr. Johnson, Thomas, you killed them?" "The decorations did," Mrs. Peterson corrected. "They need to feed too, but those were just appetizers. The big ceremony needs someone special, someone who lives in this house." That's when Mrs. Roberts started screaming. Her Christmas lights were blinking wrong. "No, I followed all the rules," she yelled. But it didn't matter. Her own Christmas tree turned towards her, lights blazing. There was a flash, and she vanished. Mr. Roberts didn't even blink. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room. Through my window, I saw all the Christmas decorations coming alive. Plastic reindeer turning their heads, snowmen walking, light strings slithering like snakes. "You can't escape, Emma," Mrs. Peterson called up. "Every Winter Light Keeper has their role. Yours is to feed the lights, just like all the other owners of this house." I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were coming for me. But I had found something in Sarah Mills's diary they didn't know about, a way to fight back. "The lights have rules," Sarah had written. "They can't cross running water. They fear mirrors, and if you can break their pattern, even for a second, their power weakens." I grabbed my bathroom mirror and the bottle of water from my nightstand. As my bedroom door started to open, I knew I had one chance to survive. But I could hear something else now, a deep rumbling under the street. Something ancient stirring in its sleep. If I broke the light's power, would that thing wake up? The door burst open. Mrs. Peterson stood there, her eyes glowing like Christmas lights. Behind her, I could see all my neighbors, their faces now looking less human and more like empty decorations. The ceremony must happen, they said together. The lights must stay on. I had to make a choice. Let them sacrifice me to keep their ancient horror asleep, or fight back and risk waking something even worse. And I only had until Christmas Eve to decide. Christmas Eve arrived with a heavy snowfall that seemed to only fall on our street. By sunset, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to be another sacrifice. I spent the day setting up my plan, mirrors on every windowsill, bottles of water placed strategically around the house. I'd studied the pattern of their lights and found a weak spot. If one house went dark, it broke their ceremony circle. At exactly midnight, they came for me. All the Christmas lights on the street turned blood red. I heard their chanting getting closer. Through my window, I watched in horror as every decoration came alive. Plastic Santas marching, reindeer pawing at the ground with glowing eyes, and snowmen sliding across lawns like ghosts. Mrs. Peterson led them, holding a ceremonial candy cane that glowed with an evil light. "Come out, Emma," she called. "Make this easy on yourself. The thing beneath must stay asleep." That's when I put my plan into action. I threw water across my front porch. Just like Sarah's diary said, the animated decorations couldn't cross it. They hissed and backed away, their lights flickering. "You fool," Mr. Roberts shouted. "You'll doom us all." I ran to my circuit breaker. If I could turn off all my lights at once, their ceremony circle would break. But as I reached for the switch, I felt the ground shake. Something deep under the street was stirring. Mrs. Peterson crashed through my back door. Her eyes were glowing like Christmas lights, and her skin looked like plastic. "We've kept it sleeping for 70 years, she screamed. "We won't let you wake it." But she slipped on the water I'd spilled and fell. Her candy cane staff shattered, and suddenly all the lights on the street flickered. The ground shook harder. Ice started creeping up the walls. The other cult members rushed in, but they were too late. I hit the circuit breaker. My house went dark. The effect was instant. All the decorations fell lifeless. The cult members screamed as their plastic features melted away. Mrs. Peterson reached for me one last time, but she crumbled into a pile of Christmas lights and empty robes. The rumbling under the street got louder. I ran outside and saw dark shapes moving under the ice. But then something unexpected happened. Without the cult's dark magic, all their evil decorations were just regular decorations again. The thing underground settled back into its sleep like it had only turned over in bed. They had been keeping it alive with their ceremonies. By breaking their power, I had actually made it weaker, not stronger. I watched as the remaining cult members aged decades in seconds, turning to dust along with their evil magic. By dawn, I was the only one left on Christmas Lane. The police finally came, finding Dave's car and evidence of all the missing people. They couldn't explain what happened, but they didn't try too hard. Some things are better left unexplained. I still live in that house on Christmas Lane. The street is normal now, with new families moving in. During Christmas, we still put up lights, regular ones, with no strange patterns or moving decorations. But sometimes, on very cold nights, I think I hear something stirring deep underground. That's when I turn on every light in my house, just to be safe. Because you never know what might be watching the lights, waiting for them to go out. I never thought I'd be afraid of bells, but here I am, Hannah Wright, sitting in my small office at St. Michael's Church Choir School, jumping at every chime and ring I hear. Let me tell you how it all started. Last September, I got my dream job teaching music at this beautiful old church school. The building itself is something out of a fairy tale, all stone walls covered in ivy, tall windows, and this massive bell tower that reaches up into the sky like a giant's finger. The kids used to joke that it was pointing at heaven, warning the angels to behave. My first few weeks were perfect. 24 bright-faced children, ages 8 to 13, all eager to learn music. Their voices were pure and clear, filling our practice hall with such beautiful sounds. The old church always felt warm and welcoming, even on cold days. But everything changed one rainy Tuesday afternoon during choir practice. We were working on Christmas songs, nothing unusual for October, since we had to prepare for the big midnight mass on Christmas Eve. I was teaching them Silent Night when the first strange thing happened. The ancient bells in the tower started ringing by themselves. Now these bells hadn't worked in years. Everyone knew that. The bell ringer, Mr. Peterson, had retired 15 years ago, and no one had replaced him. The mechanism was too old, they said, too expensive to fix. But there they were, ringing clear as day. Must be the wind, I told my confused students, trying to keep calm. But there was no wind that day, not even a breeze. That evening, while gathering my things to leave, I found an old photograph tucked inside a hymnal. It showed a choir standing on the same steps where my students practice. The date on the back read, December 24th, 1973. Something about their faces made my skin crawl. They looked empty, like they were staring at something far away that only they could see. I asked Mrs. Collins, our elderly librarian, about it the next day. The moment I mentioned the 1973 choir, all the color drained from her face. "We don't talk about them," she whispered, her hands shaking as she organized books. They disappeared, all of them, 24 children and their choir master, gone on Christmas Eve, right after midnight mass. I thought she was pulling my leg. How could an entire choir vanish? But then she showed me the newspaper articles. It was real. They had never been found. That night, I stayed late to practice some new music for the kids. The sun had set, and the practice hall was lit only by old yellow lights that made shadows dance on the walls. Then I heard it, the bells again. But this time, they weren't just ringing randomly. They were playing a melody I'd never heard before, something ancient and strange. And then I saw them, misty figures in the corner of the room, children in old-fashioned choir robes, their faces pale and serious. They disappeared when I blinked, but I knew what I'd seen. I ran to my office and locked the door, my heart pounding. On my desk was a piece of sheet music that I'd never seen before. The title read, Carol of the Bells, the true version. The notes looked wrong somehow, twisted, and in the margins, written in faded ink, were the words, "Sing this not, lest they come." That's when I realized something dark was hiding in this school's history, something that wanted to use my students, and the bells were just the beginning. Little did I know then that I had only 5 weeks until Christmas Eve to figure out what happened 50 years ago and how to stop it from happening again. Because those spirits weren't just here to sing, they were here to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, a choir that would sing forever. And now, every time those bells ring, another spirit appears, another child from the past, watching my students with hungry eyes. I have to stop this. I have to save my choir. But first, I need to tell you everything that happened. Maybe then you'll understand why I now believe that some songs should stay unsung and some bells should remain silent. The next few days were like walking through a nightmare that wouldn't end. Every morning I'd tell myself I was just being silly, that there was a normal explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew better. It started during Thursday's practice. We were working on regular Christmas songs when little Sarah, one of my youngest students, started humming something different, something that made the air feel cold. "Where did you learn that tune, Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The girl in the corner taught it to me," she said, pointing to an empty space. "She comes during practice sometimes. She says it's a special Christmas carol that will make our singing perfect." My stomach turned to ice. The other children nodded. They'd seen her too. They'd all been learning bits and pieces of this mysterious carol, each from a different ghostly child. That night, I stayed late again. I needed answers. The school's old records room was in the basement, and honestly, it was the last place I wanted to be. The single light bulb swung gently overhead, making shadows dance across dusty boxes and forgotten files. As I dug through the records, I found something strange, a diary belonging to William Matthews, the choir master who disappeared with his students in 1973. The pages were yellow and crispy, but his words were clear enough. November 15th, 1973. The children are learning it too quickly. This carol, it's changing them. Today, during practice, their voices, they didn't sound human anymore. So beautiful, but wrong. And the bells won't stop ringing. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. The entries got stranger and more frightening. December 1st, 1973. The spirits are here all the time now. They say they're former students from centuries ago. They want us to join their choir. They say we'll sing forever in their realm. I should stop this, but the music, it's in my head now. I can't forget it. The final entry was dated December 24th, 1973. Tonight is midnight mass. God forgive me, but I can't stop it now. The children know the whole carol. When we sing it, they say we'll become eternal. We'll never age, never die, just sing forever in perfect harmony. I'm afraid, but it's too late. The bells are calling. That's when I heard it. Footsteps in the dark corner of the basement. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam shaking. There stood an old man in a choir master's robe, but I could see right through him. It was William Matthews himself. "You have to help them," he whispered, his voice like rustling paper. I was wrong. So wrong. The eternal choir. It's not what we thought. We're trapped, singing the same carol forever. It's not heaven. It's a prison. And now they want your children too. Before I could ask more, he vanished. But not before I heard the bells again, and this time they sounded angry. The next day, I noticed changes in my students. They were paler, quieter. During practice, their voices started to blend in an impossible way, too perfect, too inhuman. And Tommy, usually my most energetic student, collapsed during practice. When he woke up in the nurse's office, he wasn't the same. His eyes looked older somehow, and he spoke in a voice that wasn't quite his. "The midnight hour approaches," he said, smiling strangely. "Soon we'll all sing together." That's when I realized I was running out of time. 2 days later, we found Tommy in the bell tower. He was gone. Just like that, our first loss. The official report said he'd fallen, but I knew better. The spirits had taken him. Mrs. Collins finally told me the whole truth that evening. "Every 50 years, she said, her hands clutching her teacup, the veil between our world and theirs grows thin. They need new voices to keep their choir strong. If they succeed in teaching your students the complete carol, and if the children sing it at midnight mass on Christmas Eve," she couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I looked at my calendar. It was December 1st. I had 24 days to save my remaining 23 students. But how do you fight something you can't see? How do you stop a song that's already in their heads? The bells rang again, and this time they sounded like they were laughing. The days after Tommy's death were the hardest. His empty chair in the choir room seemed to stare at us. The other kids were quiet, but not from sadness. Something was pulling them away, bit by bit. I tried everything I could think of to keep them safe. I changed our practice times, switched our songs, even covered the windows so the ghost children couldn't peek in. But you can't hide from something that's already in your head. One morning, I caught Lucy, one of my oldest students, writing music notes on her notebook. But these weren't normal notes, they were part of that forbidden carol. "Lucy, where did you learn this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "In my dreams," she whispered. "They sing to us while we sleep, Miss Wright. They say we're going to be special, perfect. Her eyes looked glazed, like she was still half dreaming. That afternoon, Father Michael, our elderly priest, pulled me aside after practice. His face was gray with worry. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "I was just a young priest when the 1973 choir disappeared. The signs are the same, the bells, the strange singing, the children changing." He pulled an old leather book from his pocket. "This might help. It's a book about the church's history." But before he could give it to me, the bells started ringing. Not their usual song, this time they rang so loud the windows shook. Father Michael grabbed his chest, gasping. By the time the ambulance came, it was too late. The book he'd tried to give me was gone. Later that week, I lost another student. Emily just vanished during practice. One minute she was standing there, the next, nothing. Just cold air where she'd been. The police searched everywhere, but like Tommy, she was gone. That night I saw her. Emily was standing in the choir room, transparent as a morning mist, but it wasn't really Emily anymore. "Why are you fighting this, Miss Wright?" Her voice echoed strangely. "We're going to be beautiful forever. No growing old, no dying. Just perfect music for all time." "Emily, this isn't right," I pleaded. "You're just a child. You should be living, growing up, not this." She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "Too late for me, but the others are almost ready. The carol is almost complete in their minds." Then I saw something that chilled me to my bones. Behind Emily stood the ghost of William Matthews, the old choir master, but he wasn't trying to warn me anymore. He was smiling, conducting an invisible choir with bony fingers. "You see," Emily said, "even he understood in the end. The music is everything." I ran to Mrs. Collins the next morning. "There has to be a way to stop this," I begged. She looked around nervously before speaking. "There might be one way," she whispered. "The carol has power because it's perfect, each note exactly right. If you could make them sing it wrong, break the pattern," I realized. "Change the harmony. But be careful," she warned. "The spirits don't like their music ruined, and the children, they might fight you. They're so deep in the spell now." She was right. When I tried to teach them different harmonies that afternoon, things got scary. Sweet little Sarah's eyes turned angry. James threw his music sheets across the room. They were slipping away from me, and fast. Worst of all, I started hearing the carol in my own dreams. It was beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. Each note promised forever, promised perfection. Sometimes I caught myself humming it while grading papers or walking home. Then I understood. It wasn't just the children the spirits wanted. They wanted me too. A choir needs its teacher, after all. With just 2 weeks left until Christmas Eve, I had lost 2 students, one priest, and maybe my own grip on reality. The bells kept ringing, the ghosts kept teaching, and my students were turning into something else, note by note, day by day. But as I watched them practice, their voices blending in that too perfect way, I made a promise. I wouldn't let them join that eternal choir. I wouldn't let them become ghosts in this old church, singing the same horrifying carol forever. I just had to figure out how to save them before midnight mass, before the carol was complete, before we all disappeared into whatever cold, dark place waited on the other side of that music. The bells rang again, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. And somewhere in the church, 22 children practiced a song that could steal their souls. With only 1 week left until Christmas Eve, things went from bad to worse. The ghost of William Matthews was everywhere now, conducting his invisible choir in the hallways, appearing in mirrors, always with that awful smile. One evening, while I was searching through more old records, I found something strange in a dusty corner, a small music box. When I opened it, it played the first few notes of that terrible carol, but something was different. The notes were fighting each other, creating a harsh sound that made my teeth hurt. Suddenly, Mrs. Collins burst into the room. "Don't close it!" she shouted. Her face was white with fear. That box, it was made by the church's first choirmaster. He created it to trap the carol's power. But before she could explain more, the bells started ringing. The music box flew out of my hands, slamming shut. When we looked up, William Matthews was there, but he wasn't alone. All around him were the ghost children, Tommy, Emily, and dozens more from 50 years ago. Their faces were cold and angry. "That box was a mistake," William said, his voice like ice. "Just like you're a mistake, Hannah, right? The carol must be perfect. The choir must be eternal." Mrs. Collins stepped in front of me. "Leave her alone? Haven't you taken enough children?" The ghost children started singing. The sound was beautiful but horrible, like icicles growing in my brain. Mrs. Collins collapsed, clutching her ears. By the time the ambulance came, she was in a coma. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the music box and what Mrs. Collins had tried to tell me. There had to be a clue there, something to help me save my students. The next morning at practice, I noticed more changes. My students' eyes had turned a pale, silvery color. When they sang, their feet didn't quite touch the ground. They were fading away, bit by bit, right in front of me. "Only 3 days left," Sarah said in a voice that wasn't hers. "Soon we'll all be together." I tried to cancel the midnight mass performance, but nothing worked. The parents wouldn't listen. They were under some kind of spell, too. They kept talking about how beautiful the singing was, how special their children had become. That's when I realized something terrible. The carol wasn't just taking the children, it was changing everyone who heard it. The whole town was falling under its power. I ran back to the music box, but William Matthews was waiting for me. "You want to know the truth, Hannah?" he said, floating near the ceiling. "I didn't just let the carol take my students. I helped it. Because perfection is worth any price." "You're wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "Music isn't supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be human." He laughed, and all the bells rang at once. "Human? Humans are flawed, weak. We offer eternity. You offer a prison." I shot back. His face changed then, turned cruel. "Last chance, Hannah. Join us willingly, or watch helplessly, as we take them all anyway." The temperature dropped so low I could see my breath. Ghost children appeared everywhere, singing that awful carol. The sound filled my head, trying to take over. But as I covered my ears, I felt the music box in my pocket. It was warm, like it was alive. And suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I had less than 3 days to figure out how this little box could save my students. 3 days before midnight mass. 3 days before the carol would be complete. And somehow, I knew this was my last chance. If I failed, we would all be singing that perfect, terrible carol forever. Christmas Eve came too fast. The church was packed for midnight mass, with everyone in town squeezed into the old wooden pews. Through the windows I could see snow falling, but it looked wrong, like it was falling up instead of down. My students stood in their choir robes, their faces pale and eager. They didn't even look like children anymore. The music box felt heavy in my pocket as I took my place at the conductor's stand. Then I saw them, hundreds of ghost children filling the empty spaces between the pews. William Matthews stood among them, his transparent hands raised, ready to conduct. The bells began to ring, but they sounded like they were underwater. "Let us begin," William announced, his voice echoing in my head. The children opened their mouths to sing. I knew I had just seconds to act. My fingers wrapped around the music box. "Wait!" I shouted. "Before we start, I want to show the children something special." I pulled out the box, opening it quickly. The harsh, fighting notes burst out, clashing with the bell sounds. William's face twisted in horror. "Stop her!" But it was too late. The music box's song grew louder, fighting against the perfect carol. It was like two songs having a battle in the air. The ghost children started flickering like bad TV pictures. "Cover your ears!" I yelled to my students. Some of them did, while others started singing the carol, their voices unnaturally beautiful. William flew at me, his ghost hands reaching for the box. "You'll ruin everything!" "That's the point," I shouted back. The box grew hot in my hands. The bells rang faster and faster. My students who were singing began to float off the ground, their eyes completely silver now. I did the only thing I could think of. I started singing the carol wrong, on purpose. Every wrong note felt like swallowing glass, but I kept going. Some of my students who had covered their ears joined in, singing it wrong with me. The church filled with two songs, the perfect, terrible carol and our messy human version. William screamed, a sound like breaking bells. "Music isn't supposed to be perfect," I shouted over the noise. "It's supposed to be alive." The music box burst open with a flash of light. The ghost children started disappearing, like snow melting in sunshine. William Matthews reached out one last time, his face twisting, before he vanished too. The bells gave one final ring and went quiet. My students, the ones who had started to fade away, fell gently back to the ground. The silver left their eyes. They were just children again, confused and a little scared but alive. But it wasn't over yet, because in that last moment, in the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In that final moment I saw them, the real choir from 1973, not as ghosts, but as solid figures. They were standing in the church doorway, looking young and confused, just as they had 50 years ago. William Matthews was with them, but he was different now, younger, with kind eyes instead of that terrible smile. "We're free," he whispered, and this time his voice sounded human. "The carol's spell is broken. We can finally rest." One by one they faded away, not like ghosts disappearing, but like people walking into a bright light. They were going where they should have gone 50 years ago, finally at peace. The music box in my hands crumbled to dust, its job done. The church was quiet now, except for the soft breathing of my students and the murmurs of confused parents. Outside, the snow fell normally again. The bells in the tower gave one last gentle ring, not a threatening sound, but a goodbye. We never did finish midnight mass that Christmas Eve. Instead, we all went home, hugging our families a little tighter than usual. The school stayed open, and my students kept singing. Regular songs now, sometimes beautifully, sometimes off-key, but always wonderfully human. Mrs. Collins recovered and came back to work, though she never went into the basement again. But sometimes, on quiet winter evenings, I think I hear faint singing from the bell tower. Not the perfect, terrible carol, but simple Christmas songs, sung by young voices. And I smile, knowing they're not trapped anymore. They're just remembering. As for me, I still teach music at St. Michael's. But now I always tell my students that the best music isn't perfect, it's real. And that's worth more than eternal anything. Just don't ask me to sing Carol of the Bells. Some songs are better left unsung.